Hi, I'm Ellie, and today we're going to continue dabbling in the art of drawing Celtic knots. Today I'm going to show you the traditional way to make complex Celtic knots based on a grid and dot framework.
Like so.
Which is the way people have been making these knots for centuries. Last week, in part 1, I showed you how to make some simple knots and gave you projects to build your confidence and skill in drawing the over-under lines, which are the basis of any knot we'll draw today. If you haven't, go back and watch that one first to get the basics down before you come back and watch this one. It's only 9 minutes long. In this video, you'll work towards making a Celtic knot frame like this, or a complex knot like this. Let's get dabbling.
I'm going to start out by demonstrating some of the major concepts on my iPad screen. First, the border. You can determine the size and shape of your knot by drawing a rectangular border on your dot and grid framework. Apart from the size, the other way that your border affects your knot is that the placement of the corners of your border on the grid dot framework affects whether or not your knot will have loose ends. Here I am drawing 3 different borders to cover all of the variations possible, and all 3 are different sizes too. By watching me fill in the knot shapes in each of these borders, you should be able to get a pretty good idea how the grid dot framework works and how the borders work. The length of each side is measured from dot to dot, so this first rectangle is 2 by 3. The second rectangle is 2.5 by 3, and the third rectangle is 3 by 3. Once you have a frame, go ahead and start drawing your knot by drawing along each diagonal line of the grid framework underneath, curving when you get close to an edge, or if you reach a corner, you can draw a point like this instead. And all you're doing is just following every diagonal line within your border and curving whenever you get close to an edge of the border. Notice that all 4 corners of this border are on dots on the framework, which means this knot has no loose ends. Let's do the same thing for the second border here. Start on a diagonal line, draw along that line until you get close to an edge, and then curve, and keep repeating that process until you've covered all of the diagonal lines within the border. Well, the top 2 corners of the border are on dots on the framework. The bottom 2 corners are on intersections, so the diagonal lines just follow right on out through the corner, making them loose ends. For this third one, I've put all 4 corners on intersections rather than dots, and you'll notice it just immediately results in 4 loose ends coming out of all 4 corners of the knot. Now we can follow along the rest of the diagonal lines and complete our knot, but in general, I would recommend that you avoid drawing all 4 corners on intersections if at all possible. Either use all 4 on dots or 2 on dots and 2 on intersections. It just looks less messy. Now I'll use techniques from my previous video to weave all of these knots over and under themselves, just so that you can see what the final product looks like. If you need help doing this part, again, go back and watch my first video. Here's a quick visual summary of how the corner placement of your borders affects your knot. Here's a quick time lapse of me drawing a ton of different borders to get a feel for how the corner placement affected the loose ends and also what different sizes and shapes of knots looked like. I'll put it in a still as a final result so that you can get a good visual overview without having to do all this work yourself. The next concept I want to introduce is the idea of internal barriers to help change the shape of the knots. Now I'm going to draw two different borders here to demonstrate this within, because the rules are slightly different depending on whether all of your corners are on dots or whether two of your corners are on intersections instead. So I'll go ahead and draw two different borders so that you can see what those rules look like in both cases. The top border is 3 by 8, so both sides are whole numbers and all the corners are on dots. The bottom border is 2.5 by 8, so the top two corners are on dots and the bottom two corners are on intersections. We'll start with the bottom border because the rules for that are easier. All internal barriers have to go straight horizontally or straight vertically, and they have to go between one dot and another dot. That is, they cannot be half or a third or a quarter of that distance. They can connect to the edges, float in the middle, or even make shapes like the square. And then you can proceed to sketch out your knot in the same way as before, treating any internal barrier just as you would the outside border and curving when your line gets close to it. When you have a border with all four corners on dots, there's one more rule, which is that you can only draw your barriers between dots that are offset 1/2 from the dots on the outside edge. This just means that you're not going to end up with any loose ends on the inside. So when you start each barrier, check that the dot that you're starting on does not line up with any of the dots on the outside. Between these two examples, you should be able to see most of the options for things you might encounter. For example, if you get to two barriers that are very close together, you will likely end up curving and then drawing a line in between the two of them, like in this case. Sometimes you will have multiple loops like this, and in that case, again, you're just making sure that you follow every diagonal line within the framework until you've filled everything. Let's speed through the actual weaving of the knots again, because that's not really what this video is about. And then we'll get on to some projects where you can try this for yourself.
As a recap, what we've learned about internal barriers is that barriers must go either up, down, or left, right. All barrier lines must start and end on a dot, and if all of the corners of your border are on dots, only draw barriers between dots not in line with the dots along the border. For our first project, you will need a pencil and eraser, some graph paper, a ruler, and a pen or marker.
I'm going to do this second project on graph paper just to show that it's perfectly achievable to do by hand, not just on an iPad. I'm going to go ahead and start by sticking this page to the table so that it doesn't move around while I film. For this project, I'm just going to draw a really nice big rectangular border to make a big knot. And to save myself time, I'm just going to put dots in the area where I'm actually drawing my border. So I start out by deciding how tall and wide I want my border. I've decided on an 8 by 8 square, and then I'm just going to quickly fill in dots at the center of every square in that area rather than covering my whole page. Now that I have my framework done, I'm going to go ahead and draw my square border. I've drawn the outside edges all from dot to dot, and it's 8 by 8 if you want to follow along and do the exact same thing. And this time I'm going to add my barriers with radial symmetry, which just means that no matter which way I rotate my knot, it will look exactly the same. And I do that by just deciding where I want a barrier and then putting it in the same place in each quadrant or corner of the square. Once you have all the internal barriers you want inside your square, go ahead and just fill in your knot in the same way as all of the other examples that you've seen today. This gets easier and easier with practice, but just follow along each diagonal line, turn at each corner or when you get close to each edge, and keep doing this until all of your diagonal lines from your framework are covered. Finally, just like the other ones, go ahead and draw your woven over-under pattern as you follow along each line until you have a beautiful, large, complex Celtic knot. Go ahead and erase any leftover pencil marks as well as you can, and there you have it. As you continue to experiment with the sizes and shapes of your borders and internal barriers, you should be able to produce pretty much infinite variability in your Celtic knots. In this project, we're going to draw a frame instead of a rectangular border by drawing one large rectangle for the outside and then a smaller rectangle inside. I'm going to recommend that your outside rectangle be from dot to dot on all four corners, and then you can make your frame look nice and even by drawing your internal lines 1.5 or maybe 2.5 if you'd rather distance in from the outside borders. By having your inside frame 1.5 or 2.5 units away from the outside measurement, what that allows for is for you to put barriers wherever you want, because this follows the rules of the first internal barriers example I showed you. So go ahead and start adding barriers wherever you want, as long as they're always either vertical or horizontal and always go between one dot and another. I'm going to try and make mine a little bit symmetrical, but you do whatever you want and it should work just fine as long as you follow those two rules. Next, go ahead and draw your knot by following along all of the diagonal lines in the framework inside your border, remembering to curve away anytime you get close to a barrier or to the outside edge of your border. Finally, go ahead and grab your marker and weave your line over and under itself to create that finished knot effect. For an extra clean look, go ahead and erase your border and framework, and there you have a very nice Celtic frame.
Thank you for drawing Celtic knots with me today. If you, like me, are always looking for creative things to try, consider subscribing. I'll be posting at least one video a week about whatever I'm currently dabbling in. For now, goodbye and keep dabbling. I'll see you next week.